afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Juwan Johnson, the Interim Director of the Lemon Project, Interim Robert Francis Ings Director of the Lemon Project, A Journey of Reconciliation, and I'd like to welcome you to our afternoon porch talk. And before we get started, I'm going to do our land and labor acknowledgement. William and Mary acknowledges the indigenous peoples who are the original inhabitants of the lands our campus is on today. The Cherenhaka Nottoway, Chickahominy, Eastern Chickahominy, Mattaponi, Monacan, Nansemond, Nottoway, Pamunkey, Petawomic, Upper Mattaponi, and Rappahannock tribes, and pay our respect to their tribal members, past and present. Our labor acknowledgement. The Board of Visitors acknowledges that William and Mary, enslaved people, exploited them and their labor, and perpetuated the legacies of racial discrimination. The board profoundly regrets these activities, apologizes for them, expresses its deep appreciation for the contributions made by the African and African American members of its community to the vitality of William and Mary, then, now, and for all time coming, and commits to continue our efforts to remedy the lingering effects of past injustices. And in the vein of that statement, our porch talk today is Reparative Public History, the Colored Rosemont Community History Initiative. And I'm going to take some time to introduce briefly our guest speakers. Audrey Davis is the director of the African American History Division of the Office of Historic Alexandria in Alexandria, Virginia. Ms. Davis is the past president of the Virginia Association of Museum Councils, VAM, and the Alexandria Historical Society. She is one of the founders and the current president of Virginia Africana Associates Incorporated. Since the mid-1980s, Garrett Fessler has worked as a historical archaeologist in the Chesapeake region. Since 2011, he serves as the deputy city archaeologist in Alexandria, Virginia. Before that, he co-owned and operated the James River Institute for Archaeology in Williamsburg, Virginia. Kristen Moon is a professor of history and American studies at the University of Mary Washington and currently serves as the WAPO Faculty Fellow. Her teaching and research center on 19th and 20th century U.S. history with a particular emphasis on Northern Virginia's African American and immigrant communities. Francesco Di Salvatore is a public historian, memory worker, and archivist with a deep commitment to fostering ethical and stakeholder-driven historical preservation. Francesco has had the honor of serving as a public historian in various roles and regions in the country, such as the Special Collections at the University of Illinois at Chicago, the National Public Housing Museum, and StoryCorps. They are an ABD PhD student at George Washington University. Congratulations on that. And they are completing a dissertation about the political and cultural history of the NYPD during the mid-20th century. And last but not least, Veronica Green Pace was born in Alexandria and lives in the city, except for 5 years, for 74 years. Attended Alexandria Public Schools, Charles Houston Elementary, graduated in 1964 from Parker Gray High School. 1964, 1966, Veronica attended Howard University, retired from the Department of the Army after 36 years. Veronica is a member of Russell Temple Christian Methodist CME Church in Alexandria for 69 years. Recently, a member of the Stakeholders Advisory Group for the Colored Rosemont Historic Marker. Let's give them a virtual applause. And at this time, I would like to pass it along to Kristen Moon.
Oh, I think, is it supposed to be Audrey?
Oh, yes.
Okay, go to Audrey.
Audrey Davis, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Thank you, Dr. Thomas. We are the Colored Rosemont Community History Initiative is pleased to be here today for the Lemons Legacies Porch Talk. You can see on the screen our agenda for today, but before we start, and I turn it over to Veronica and Kristen, I'd like to mention two people who are part of our group, and one who is on camera, one who's off camera, Mr. Stanley Green, who is sitting next to his sister, Veronica Green Pace, and then also Michael Johnson from the City of Alexandria, the Department of Recreation and Cultural Activities, who's a longtime member of our group. So we're so pleased to be here, and I will now turn it over to Veronica and Kristen to provide you with some background about Colored Rosemont.
Oh, okay. I was born right there at 1312 With Street. I was born at home. I was delivered by Dr. Oswald Durant. And at that time, there were many home births because Black doctors did not have privileges, particularly in Alexandria, at the Alexandria City Hospital. This project is very, very dear to me. And I can't express the deep emotions that I have for the opportunity to record it and have the sign there. So people who are not from Alexandria or new to Alexandria will know that there was a vibrant Black community there, and we were homeowners. And it was an opportunity, number one, in a way to pay homage to my parents, who worked very hard. My father was at Virginia State College at that time. It's Virginia State University when World War II broke out, and he and his twin brother volunteered for service to this country. And when they were building what they were calling then the War Department, which became the Defense Department, the Pentagon, that was part of the migration that took place for people, for especially Blacks, looking for decent jobs. And so that's how they came to Alexandria. They're originally from Orange County, Virginia. And what is important to me is to have it recorded and documented. But we stand on the shoulders of our ancestors who endured so much. And they wanted the American dream, just like everybody else. Home ownership, live at peace, raise a family, educate their children. And that's what happened in Colored Rosemont. And I've always pushed against the stereotypes and the tropes about Blacks, African Americans in America, and particularly Alexandria. Colored Rosemont was a vibrant community, just like everything, like every place else that had a community. I was thinking about this a lot, and I'm sure many of you have heard about, or it's a kind of a joke about Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. And they said that Ginger Rogers was probably a better dancer than Fred Astaire because everything Fred Astaire did, she did it backwards. And so I compare that to being Black in America and being Black in Alexandria because I was born in apartheid, yeah, American apartheid, if you will, segregation. So we had to do everything everybody else did under constraints of segregation, and that it was to work, to survive, and to thrive despite what we were up against. And in our community, that's what we did. I always think about the continuum of home, school, and church. We had the same shared values. And when you compare it against some of the values that we look at today in some communities, they're not there. So what happened at home was reinforced at school and also emphasized at church. And we had that. And the thing about, and all of you know this, I'm not saying anything new, that Blacks are not a monolith. And I always focus on our traditions. While my parents came from the Piedmont area, if you will, of Virginia, we also had people in our community who migrated from deeper south, South Carolina, Georgia. I don't remember anybody from Mississippi. But the diversity, just because we're all Black, there was a distinct diversity in our community based on our geographical migration, based on our food ways, our ways that we practice our faith traditions. So everything that America tried to say that was different of the otherism of us is not true. So it was a great opportunity to highlight that we were a vibrant community, we were good people, and we were hardworking people. So I relish the opportunity, and I will always remember working as a stakeholder in this project. On the left, you see my parents. That's John Henry Green, and that's my mom, Carrie Maxwell Allen Green. And in our home, the children always came first. We were a priority for our parents. It was nothing greater, nothing more important, and the emphasis was always what is best for the children. The next photos later, and that's my three sisters. Tammy is holding my daughter at the time, the little baby there, and that's a friend, Stephanie, Tammy Green, Vanessa Green, Robin Green, and our next door neighbor, Demeen Bass. Her grandfather had his own trucking and hauling business, although he was a Alexandria city worker. And the next photo is also my baby sister Tammy holding the present, Demeen Bass, who was raised next door at 1300 With Street. And that's me holding my darling daughter, Saranya Yolanda Pace. So family, this is for me a real depiction of the family values. And in the background, in the middle, the picture in the middle, you'll see the safe sign that says Safeway. It was a grocery store, but all of that is now the Braddock Road Metro Station. So I can go on, but I'll stop right there. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. So thanks to the Greens and other members of our stakeholder group, we have taken their stories and their advice and oral histories and started to build out a working timeline. And that's what you see before you. This is a sort of an amorphous organic document, but it's sort of helping us understand the emergence of Colored Rosemont and also the various structural forces that have adversely impacted this community. We now know, thanks to, again, our stakeholders, that the story of this community actually dates to the late 19th century when speculators, both Black and white, tried to develop this area. And in fact, as early as 1888, there were attempts to create a quote unquote Black settlement in this neighborhood. That, unfortunately, for reasons that we haven't figured out, didn't launch, but it did 30 years later by the 1920s. And this is where we start to see Black homeowners purchasing, raising their families, going to church, having their kids go to school, etc. That continues through the 1950s, through the 1970s, where we start to see various forms of segregationist practices adversely impacting the neighborhood, most notably through eminent domain practice, whether we're talking about public housing, adjacent to the neighborhood, schools, but also various forms of green space. Veronica actually brought up Safeway. That part, which was across the street, was also Black owned at one time by folks who actually lived in the Colored Rosemont neighborhood as well. So there's all this new stuff that we are coming to terms with. And then by the 1980s, Alexandria in general becomes this place of sort of real estate speculation again, in part because of the expansion of the federal government and also an uptick in immigrant and refugee communities. And developers come into neighborhoods like Colored Rosemont, buy huge swaths of land, build townhomes or condos, and then either rent or sell many times to some of the immigrant and refugees or actually their descendants who have become part of our community fabric as well. And with that, I'm going to toss it, I think, to Audrey. Yes? Okay.
Or I think it was me than Audrey. Sorry, there's a lot
That's
of speakers.
okay.
A lot of speakers on the call. Yeah, good to be with everyone. Hello. Just before I kind of go on, are there any questions so far about Colored Rosemont, or any comments or reflections that have come up for any of you? Feel free to write them in the chat, or I think we can even unmute people if need be. Chat. Yeah, and throughout the presentation, feel free to jump in with any questions or comments. But yeah, just pivoting out of kind of just the history of Colored Rosemont. A big part of what we wanted to talk about today is the community history initiative that we've taken on about Colored Rosemont and how we've put it together. And like everyone on this call, when doing this work, it's really about experimenting. And so we really don't think we have the answers per se, but this is us experimenting with different ways to do public history and historic preservation. And so, a lot of the traditional tools you can kind of get from historic preservation, what we have found is a number of shortcomings that we needed to address when taking on this project. And a big shortcoming is the power indifference that has historically been part of the field when it comes to stakeholders and the institutions who are working on it. When it comes to historic preservation, there's really been an overemphasis on the built environment, on buildings versus people, and because of that, we've missed out on a lot of important historical interpretation that should be happening about communities. When it comes to Colored Rosemont, there's not many of the original homes left, for example. So if we were to rely on kind of traditional forms of historic preservation, how would we tell that history? So that's one sort of shortcoming. Another one is that it tends to be reactionary versus proactive, right? And this is probably something that you might find your you might find your institution doing too, is not having kind of an overarching vision of how to do this work, and instead kind of always reacting as the public, brings things to the institution. For example, Mr. Green maybe will talk about this later, but a lot of this happened because of his advocacy in particular, and which is great. But also, how do we create a more proactive historic preservation process that's not constantly just reacting and making decisions on the fly? And another major shortcoming too is thinking about, and I think Ms. Green's talked about that. Like there's a trauma that comes to these memories and to these histories that need to be considered when putting together a project like this. And it does require interdisciplinary approaches to the work that, again, historic preservation might not offer. And also, right, we have to kind of deal with the thorny relationship between preservation and consumption and tourism, right? And how historical districts have commonly led to gentrification and displacement of yeah.
I'm sorry.
You need to leave?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. That's okay. Yeah. And so
I'm sorry if you want to leave.
okay.
Time is called.
Okay. I think Mr. Green wants to leave, but thanks for being here.
Thank you.
So yeah, and so this is sort of some of the shortcomings we kind of had to think through, and also institutionally, there's things that were kind of put in place so that we could figure out a more ethical way to do this work. So I'm going to turn it over to Audrey to kind of start with talking about the African American History Division.
Thank you, Francesco. The Division of African American History was established in 2023. During the pandemic, the Office of Historic Alexandria underwent a reorg to provide better services and to be more accountable to the communities that we serve. We have 8 historic sites, we have a park, we have a reading room, we have signage around the city, but we wanted to make sure that we were reaching all areas and all constituencies. African American history was really at the core of the reorg. While things have not always been perfect, as Francesco has said, we have made great strides in the way we interact with multiple communities, with donors, and with friends groups. We aim to be transparent in our actions, respectful of all histories and communities, and to make sure that our audiences have agency so that they can trust us and the work we do. When the work is sensitive, we give families the lead and how they want us to handle their stories. And we also have trauma therapists who can work with the families and provide assistance free of charge for families that need that additional help. When artwork or creativity is involved, we make sure that the creators retain their copyright to their own artwork, that we use it for educational purposes, but we do not take over the rights for their creations. We also have a social justice initiative, the Alexandria Community Remembrance Project, and that comes out of our work with the Equal Justice Initiative, or EJI, in Montgomery, Alabama. And it's our way of making our community aware of our history of racial terror hate crimes. We have 2 documented lynchings. If you are interested in the work that we do via social justice, if you just Google City of Alexandria, our website, and look for the Alexandria Community Remembrance Project, you can find information about not only our work, about our pilgrimage in 2022 to Montgomery, Alabama, but you can also sign up for a free newsletter that provides interesting history about African American history and life in Alexandria, but also about social justice movements around the country. We are very proud of the work that we are doing. We are a stronger department than we have been. We have made great friends in this process, and I think we have established trust in that forefront for all of us in the Office of Historic Alexandria and the Division of African American History, and throughout our departments, is that the families and the history come first. We have incredible, real, and amazing history. We have traumatic history. We have sites like our Freedom House site, where you can learn about the domestic slave trade. Alexandria was one of the hubs for the domestic slave trade. You can visit the Black History Museum, which you're seeing on your screen. And you can also visit our African American Heritage Park, our Watson Reading Room, which has over 4,000 volumes on African American history and culture. So we welcome you to visit Alexandria and to learn more about what we're doing with the Colored Rosemont Community History Initiative. And now I'll turn it back over to Francesca.
Yeah, so I mean, so like the reorg that Audrey's talking about has had profound effects on how our institution interprets history. And sort of another change that's happened recently is that the city in 20 around COVID, there was a desire really from council to create an oral history position in the city that was dedicated to recording oral histories. Oral histories have been collected in the city since 1970s, but it was always sort of tagged on to other responsibilities that an archaeologist was doing or a historian. But there's a push around COVID to create a more formal oral history program, and so the Oral History Center that I manage was launched. I was hired in 2022 to create a more formal program, and so because of this creation of the center, we've been able to apply a lot of oral history methods to the historical preservation process in a more dedicated way, and so. I mean, outside of this project, the center also works on a number of other projects. We also provide, a big part of what we do is really to provide residents with resources to do their own, historical interpretation work, specifically oral history projects. So we have an annual program where we train residents to do oral history, and they work on their own projects, and those projects are included in our archive and things like that. But when it comes to sort of the specific oral history methods that have been helpful for Colored Rosemont, and also just generally other projects we're working on now, some of those methods that are really ingrained in oral history. One of them is this idea of redistributing power. Oral history as a method provides that ethic and that tool, because for any oral history, it's always about centering the narrator's perspectives, their experiences, their agency, and their authority from the project design. From the project design to the conversation, interview, and all the way to the preservation and use of the interview. And so, in many ways, this can be applied to any historical preservation process, and really should. And it's not, what we think a lot about is not just how do we give descendants not just input, but actual power. I think, and there's a big difference. We see a lot of projects that will try to collect input and suggestions, and sometimes don't follow through with it. And so for our process, our community history initiative process, a big part of it is that descendants like Miss Green have to sign off on what we do. It simply cannot just be us receiving input from them and us considering it, but they actually are a formal party to this process. Another important value and ethic from oral history, right, is the idea of popular education. It's the idea that, those who have been harmed by state and extra legal forms of violence, they carry knowledge that can deeply shape our understanding of the past and present, right? And so it's really challenging a more top-down process, but thinking through and really materializing how to treat people who've actually experienced harm and specifically state violence, how they are the experts, right? And they really teach us a lot about the past and the present. Another element, right, is this idea of healing and care work that oral history provides us, right? In understanding that we need to have a trauma-informed approach to interviewing and to the entire preservation process. And so, Audrey mentioned that we do work with therapist consultants, that we're happy to share their contact information. They're really great. They're really familiar with public history, and they're obviously, experts in therapy, and so that they know how to kind of cross those two different fields really well. And then the last one, right, is the idea of creating a more reparative process, right, and that can look like that can kind of span different ways. So, interpersonally, oral history really teaches us that, as practitioners, we have to understand our own privilege, our own power, right? What does it mean for a city government to work with a descendant community, right? Especially a city government that was involved in the displacement of that community, right? So having to do the reflection work on that, what does it mean for someone like myself to be interviewing, right, on the screen, but also thinking about larger structures, right, and how we can create more reparative structures. That's something that, we don't have a clear answer for, but that is really a key question: is how do we connect these things to actual social change, to policy changes in the city? And so, in part, other divisions in the city are, we'll be reading, for example, Dr. Moon's report about Colored Rosemont, and our hope is that it would, shift housing policy in the city, for example. So with those tools and a central focus on African American history in Alexandria, we were able to kind of craft what we call a community history initiative that, again, is really about redistributing power within the City of Alexandria's historical preservation process. It's about bridging historical preservation with memory work and public history practices, and especially important, utilizing trauma-informed approaches, and creating a process that understands that historic preservation is also a form of care work, and we have to take that really seriously. And and this is generally, when we work on a project like Colored Rosemont, this is generally our process that we follow. The first part is key, right? It's building trust and relationships. And so, for Colored Rosemont, we spent many years just meeting and talking, and I'll talk about this in the next slide, but we created a scope of work for the project much later on, because we needed to sort of build relationships first. And once we do that, we do create a scope of work, and then we get into the second part, right, which is doing collections, material collections, oral history collections, preservation, also what Dr. Moon is working on, right, creating a more comprehensive research report. And then also we try to think a lot about how to activate these collections. And so for the Colored Rosemont Initiative, we spent, like I said, 2 years really meeting and slowly talking about the scope of work. We were meeting monthly for a lot of this period. We now meet quarterly because our scope of work is completed. But some of the things that we all agreed on so when I say we, I mean city staff and what we call a descendant advisory group. So Ms. Green's part of it. Mr. Green, who is here, is also part of it. And so we were meeting monthly, and we created a scope of work that lays out things like not just that we're going to create an oral history collection, but how are we going to create that? And so Ms. Green in the advisory committee was involved in setting parameters around release forms, around how we conduct the actual interviews. There also that relates to the collection of material objects. They were heavily involved with creating the interpretive sign that's outside of the Greens home right now. We're going to be creating a public brochure. We have created an interactive website, and then the last part is what Dr. Moon's working on, a research report. So I'm going to turn it over to, one thing before I turn over to Garrett, we did have just curiosity just from the audience, like how have your projects or your institutions sort of dealt with the question of how to center stakeholders and descendants? And I know that's a big conversation, but we're just curious to hear sort of how you in your own work have kind of dealt with that question, and what structures or practices have been important for you. So feel free to write them in the chat, or I think we can unmute you if you like to speak. So. No. If you also save this question for the end, if you want to share. Oh, I think I heard someone talking.
I think that was Francesco. I think that was me putting on my microphone. Why don't I say a few words about my involvement, and that will give folks out there maybe a little bit more time to give some thought to weighing in. My role, I'm Garrett Fessler. I'm one of the city's archaeologists, and my role in the project, you would think because of my title that my role was to do something archaeological. And in this case, that's not the case. But my role has been kind of to be able to get a foot in the door to bring attention to this kind of project, because here in the city we have a archaeological preservation code, and I'm the one who mostly sees the projects as they come across my desk. So the code applies to projects, to development projects across the city, and certainly and most importantly, on bigger projects that affect larger areas of land. We don't apply the code rigorously to single family homes and things like that, or people doing smaller projects, but it applies to the larger projects in particular. And so back in COVID times, project was put forth by a development team to develop the block across the street from Mr. Green's house. And we started the process of applying the code, which meant first we have an outside archaeologist or historian do a documentary study, which was done. And then we reviewed that and then continued to follow through the steps of the archaeological code. Now, in this case, we did not see that archaeology was going to be warranted on this project. But the code allows us to sort of make sure that none of these projects slip through the cracks. And although we didn't find that archaeology was necessary on the project area, we did then be able to call for other elements. Like we have the documentary study that was done, and we can also tag these developments to do interpretation. And sometimes that involves signs, sometimes that involves something more elaborate, building history into the fabric of whatever the development is putting up. But in this case, I was able to then kind of team up with others in the city and then start to kind of hopefully put together what eventually became the Community History Initiative for Colored Rosemont. I don't want to take away from Mr. Stanley Green and the credit that he has needs to have, because he was an advocate for many, many years for people to look at this neighborhood as an important place in Alexandria. And so I think Mr. Green really gets the credit. I sort of followed behind him and helped make sure that attention was brought to the project. So that's been my role. Maybe someday down the line, we may be able to dedicate some archaeology to the neighborhood. At this point, we're going to let the other important pieces fall together: the background study that Dr. Moon's doing and the oral history collecting that Francesco's doing. So that's the role that I've been able to play in the project. Francesco, I'll pitch it back to you.
Yeah, great. And yeah, and so as Garrett said, because of the process that was triggered across the street, there's historical markers that will be tied to that, and so that also triggered us to also work on creating a sign on the other side where you can see Mr. Green's home, or the Green's family home.
Is that West Street project?
Yeah, the West Street project. Yeah. And so so during the 2-year period of creating a scope of work and fleshing out things, we also at the same time were creating with the advisory group this sign, which it has very limited wording, right? For those who have worked on historical markers, it's challenging because you have very little space to work with. But we spent a lot of meetings talking about the wording, and it wasn't easy. And so it specifically around the sort of around the question of, not question, but the sort of the situation that happened with displacement in the neighborhood, and how we talk about it. Do we use wording like eminent domain? And we ended up using a different language to describe it. And so that was a challenge. Yeah,
It was.
Yeah,
And
I don't know if you want to talk about it.
I was there. I witnessed the men in our neighborhood going to City Hall to several meetings. They used, I think, and I don't think I know, their predicate was that it was a rundown community, that the housing, they didn't say it straight out, but the inference was that it was substandard, and that was totally inaccurate. And the houses were intact, were well kept. But this is a practice that we've known in history that happens to Black communities. They use that predicate that, okay, it's run down, it needs to be redeveloped, it needs to be rehabilitated, and we're going to build something else that'll be more for the common good. And my dad and the men in the neighborhood pushed back against that, but we see what the result is. And the back and forth that we had with the city attorney about it was eminent domain was really puzzling and challenging to us, because that's what the statute said when you pulled the documentation on what happened to 1315, which was directly across from where we lived, 1312, because they would not take the city offer to sell their property, and they resisted. So the city sued them, and it's right in the statute is in the paperwork, it's in the document, it's in the filing of the suit, and that statute is that they use is for eminent domain. So that caused a lot of consternation and a lot of back and forth and a lot of wordsmithing to come up with the language for the verbiage for the signage. So that was a challenging part of this project. Historical accuracy. The historical accuracy is that they did use eminent domain. Now, a few residents did go ahead voluntarily to sell to the city before the city, sued them.
Yeah.
But always go for historical exactitude, to tell the truth. So that was a challenging part for us on the Color Rosemont project.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an example, right, of the question of, when approaching these projects, like, should certain institutions and organizations even work on these projects? Because sometimes they can commit more harm. And it's not always straightforward, but this is an instance, right, where there was tension with like the city attorney and around how to describe this. And so again, like, and Dr. Boone's researching this further about the details of it. But it's a situation that, right, that I'm sure you face in your own projects, that you have to kind of navigate, the potential of like institutional harm in misinterpreting history, and in order to, comply with their own institutional rules and reputation and things like that. So, but I think in some ways we did come to a place that we were satisfied, collectively.
We're running out of time too.
We're also running out of time. Yeah. So just to carry over, I won't go deep in detail, but we are working on oral history collection. We've recorded upwards of 20, 25 oral histories. Some are public, some are still pending, in large part because we not just, we spent a lot of time throughout the entire process with narrators. And so when it comes to after the recording, we spent a lot of time with narrators in reviewing their oral history and making sure they're comfortable with it being released. And so it does mean that oral histories are released a little slower, but it means that narrators really get to have control over their story. And so typically for, what we do in Colored Rosemont, but really generally what we do is we spend a lot of time doing a pre-interview for recordings. And sometimes that can be like a 30-minute meeting where we meet with narrators, but a lot of times it's multiple meetings in order to build relationships and trust and start to kind of think through what it is that they want to share in their recording. For this project, we obviously have a lot of research questions, but that's not necessarily guiding these oral history recordings. We really treat them as like life histories, and we want narrators to really be in charge of what they talk about. And so we're never imposing our own research questions, or trying not to, at least. And we do think a lot about what I call or not what I call, but we've talked a lot about trauma-informed approaches. So we always create like a narrator care plan during this pre-interview period. And this involves having conversations about what they don't want to talk about in the recording, or if they're going to bring up any challenging, potentially, triggering content, how can we best support them in telling that story? And so sometimes we do then consult with therapists to help with those moments. But we also have practices that I use and other staff who do recordings use. And so, then we obviously go into our interview, which we honestly rarely do 40-minute interviews. They tend to be more 90 minutes to 2 hours, sometimes 3. We sometimes break them up into multiple recording sessions. And so I won't go deep in detail with everything, but also I'm happy if folks want to follow up afterwards with questions more about oral history. I'm happy to talk to them about it. And I also want to mention that Carrie Reed worked a lot on these oral histories too. He was a former oral historian on staff that worked on this the past couple of years. So I'll turn it over to Kristen.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm sort of noticing the time, so I'm going to try to keep my comments a little brief. The archival process and the research that I have been doing actually has been a later part of this overall project. And in part because of that, the archival research has been informed by our stakeholders, particularly Ms. Green and the story that she just shared. I've heard before, and that was in many ways my guiding principle in terms of the types of methodology I used. to do this research, which is actually still ongoing, and the types of priorities that I had. In particular, I work with public documents. You can see a list of all the different types of materials that I've been working with. We also have, and Francesco, if you can go to the next slide, a very unique collection called the Davis Ruffner Title Company records. These are housed at the City Record Center. It is actually, though, unprocessed. So it's sort of a Where's Waldo experience in terms of what you're going to find in a box. And so you can see actually on the left what the boxes look like. They have the boxes, of course, that's new housing for this collection. But some of these records actually show architectural designs. You can see one right here in the middle. And then one of our exciting discoveries in terms of the archival record are examples of some of the homeowners in Colored Rosemont obtaining HOLC loans. We had not seen that here in the City of Alexandria. And because the National Archives have destroyed almost all of the HOLC files, to find those types of records within our local records is an amazing feat for us. And I'm really excited about that. And that's actually what the letter is on the right. It's one of our city engineers trying to explain to the HOLC that because Alexandria is an old city, sometimes people build houses across property lines, and that it's okay. We're not going to move the houses. Just get over it and help these people. So it's really kind of a funny letter from the city to the HOLC. Francesco, if you could go to my next slide. Some of our other exciting discoveries is this plat map on the right, as well as this newspaper article. Here, one of the developers or owners of one of the blocks in Alexandria that will be part of Colored Rosemont is actually talking about creating a Black neighborhood as early as 1888. And in fact, we have now found 2 people who bought parcels at this time, presumably part of the initiative to create a Black neighborhood of homeowners. And then actually this plat map shows you the design of this sort of modern suburban neighborhood that would be there. Now, unfortunately, this stalls out and doesn't really evolve into the neighborhood that we know as Colored Rosemont until the 1920s. And as Ms. Green mentioned, many of the people who end up buying in that time come from all over the South who have migrated up to Northern Virginia for work. This is another type of great migration that we really haven't thought about in terms of our broader narrative. And in fact, one of the earliest purchasers that I found is actually a Barbadian immigrant. He was a minister who had trained at Bishop Payne Seminary in Petersburg and had just gotten a position at Mead Memorial Episcopal Church in Alexandria. So that was pretty exciting to find that type of information as well. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over. I think it's to Francesco for the next slide.
Yeah, we just wanted to end and open up the Q&A, but just offer some small recommendations that we've learned that, and also sort of maybe they're ideals too that we're trying to reach for. But really thinking about these processes, really centering the idea of people over buildings. There's definitely a lot of tools from traditional forms of historic preservation that can help with these projects, but we have to also bring in other methods and practices like memory work, public history, archival research, things like that. And really think about the work as a form of political advocacy. Again, that's like a never-ending ideal, or how to really do it. But within city government, again, we try to think about how to connect this work to other divisions, like the planning office, for example, how this work can inform their own practice. Thinking about our work, right, as a form of care work, which we've talked a lot about today. We haven't talked a lot about Section 106, but some of your sites, some of your cities you might be more familiar with Section 106, but Section 106 can really open up possibilities to do this work. And so really, we've thought a lot about how we can kind of go against the grain of what's been done for 106 to also not just include like archaeological code, which is commonly used, but how do we also incorporate public history into Section 106, so that there's more robust work being done for these processes. And so yeah, I won't go through all these, but I'll leave. We'll share these slides out too. But I want to open it up to any questions or comments. And yeah, thanks for being with us today.
All right, let's give our speakers a round of a virtual applause. Thank you all so much for this wonderful conversation and presentation on this really important piece of history. I think let's see if we have some questions. If you have any questions that you would like to ask, please place them in the chat. And we may be able to unmute someone if you actually did the hand raise function. And if you want to ask your question, you're welcome to do that.
I have a question for Dr. Moon. So, yeah, sure. Okay. I'm muted.
Yeah,
Dr. Moon, I just have a question about one of your slides, the plat map for 1891. Those streets were already named back then?
Yeah, it was platted back then, but it wasn't named.
Okay.
Yeah, no, that was one of our exciting finds, is that actually that block, which is, of course, where your family home is, was actually drawn in 1891, and that actually in 1888 and 1889, some Black families from Fauquier County purchased 2 parcels. So again, there's just so many new things to find about this neighborhood. Every time I just sort of poke at something, I find something amazing that challenges our local history as well as our national history. Things like the HOLC, for example, is really exciting. So it's in the shared drive. So you should be able to grab if you want to download. That's one of our things is all the documents I'm talking about, we put in a shared drive so that our stakeholders, if they want to download things, they're welcome to.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yep.
So we have a question here. Have there been any reparations paid to the descendants? That was my question as well. Beyond preservation efforts, what kind of tangible, forms of repair have been given to descendants?
I can speak to, this is not to Colored Rosemont specifically. We do have in Alexandria the Virginia Theological Seminary that made a great deal of news a few years ago when they began to pay reparations to their descendants, and they are still doing that. And I know that we have some people that are on the Zoom today who have worked with that project. But also for us, we are coming up next week on April 23rd on the anniversary of our first lynching victim, Joseph McCoy. And we have worked with the family, the descendants of Joseph McCoy, for many years. And what we always do is, as a form of reparations, we always make sure that they are with us if they would like to be. We pay travel, we pay hotel meals for them to come and be with us whenever we have a remembrance. When we did our pilgrimage in 2022, we invited them to join us and all expenses were paid. We allow them to, we also want their advice, not just allow, but have their advice when we do our oral history work, when we have research that's been done, that we presented each one with a fully detailed family tree and history. So we try to aid in any way we can. And for both of our descendants of our lynching victims, they did not know about this history until we presented it. So again, we offered the services of trauma therapists to them and are available to them at any time in our process. If someone in their family is just learning about the history and feels that they need this, we can offer it.
Great. Also, I wanted to know, and you've given a substantial amount of advice, but I guess a group that's just getting started, what points of advice would you give to them?
Listen to the descendants. Listen, don't talk, don't, don't, but be there to hear. Um, and I mean, it's not, there's no secret sauce here. It's be there to hear what people want to tell you, and hopefully then that allows us to move forward and build program, or whatever comes out of that. But listen, be sure to listen.
As a stakeholder in the project for Colored Rosemont, my brother Stanley had to leave because he had a previous engagement, I guess, but it was advocacy. He contacted the city and he persisted in that. And advocacy is also, I would also say advocacy / activism. Because if it's important, and it is important, our history is important, you had to advocate and you have to be active. So I'm sorry Stanley had to leave, and he could speak a lot more about that on being persistent, contacting the right people, follow up, including other people, finding other stakeholders, trying to get them interested. And his emphasis has always been on being tactful about it. Because it could get a little rocky because number one, there may be stakeholders who are sensitive about it, have bad memories, if you will, or trauma, I think is the term we're using here. And then coming up, I think, in one of your slides about the imbalance of power. Who has the power? The people who hold the records, the people who make decisions, et cetera. So you have to be tactful about that too, approaching, city officials. And I did discuss some about our challenging interaction we had with the city attorney about using the term eminent domain. So advocacy, activism, and tact, and trying to make sure that you contact as many stakeholders and as many interested people as possible, and be persistent. Attend the meetings, keep the contacts going.
And I'll just quickly add on top of that too is I think as someone who's working within the institution, right, or like the city staff on the call, right, like really what I see I think institutions are, I mean, maybe this is a negative way to put it, but I don't think it's cynical, but I think it's a reality that institutions are going to commit harm on projects like this. And so as city staff, I think we think a lot about how we can reduce some of that harm. We can't eliminate it, but we can try to reduce it through our own advocacy internally. But also just, I think if you're starting on a project, really thinking about, should your institution or organization, if you're part of one, should they be working on this project? And being honest with yourselves and really trying to understand, really looking internally at your own institution. Because, for example, if you're working with undocumented populations, I don't know if for example, a city government might be the best institution to be working on a project like that, right? Because of potential collaborations with other institutions that could commit harm, to those communities, for example. So I think partly it's like really doing some of the deep work of how much harm could be done, how could you reduce some of that harm as a person within that institution. I think is really important. And I think also just adding, like, communities have always preserved their histories. They don't necessarily need us per se, but there are resources that can be redistributed to support projects. And so I think institutions have an important place, but they don't necessarily need us. And I think that's really important, and also humbling, to understand that, yeah. So
Yeah, I want to, and thank you for making that point, Francesco. I also wanted to emphasize that these institutions are public, often institutions that have a duty to communities. And with that, I wanted to ask, in what ways are you all assessing the progress um, of the work? How are you interrogating the practices and doing any kind of assessment as it relates to the goals or aspirations you like to obtain?
I can start and folks want to come in, but yeah, so this goes back to the part of not being reactive but proactive. And so we're trying to think, I think, right now it's been very reactive. This project started again, Mr. Green. I remember him contacting us back in 2021, 2022 about this, and us all meeting. It's slowly starting, but and and it's great to be reactive and have the ability to do that as an institution. But I think the next stage of this, of not just Colored Rosemont, but just like how to make community history initiative process more robust is to, number one, probably have, a more comprehensive interpretive plan for the entire city that actually states like a mission and value for how to do the work and what is under the umbrella, what can be included under the umbrella of a community history initiative. Also creating, an assessment tool for after these during and after these projects, where people, for example, like having the Descendant Advisory Group fill out an assessment of how this has gone, what needs to be improved. So we're thinking, I think we've had conversations about creating an assessment tool like that, but then also we also sort of, and we've had very brief conversations, but I think it needs to be thought about more, is creating, we have a commission, for example, on historical interpretation in the city, but how do we sort of also create a different commission that's made up of descendants from all these different projects we're working on that can collaborate with the existing commission right now, is another way I think we can expand the work, make it more accountable. So yeah, that's just some thoughts.
And also, we have another person, I think, with a question or a comment. Mary Lassiter, I see you're unmuted.
Oh, am I unmuted?
Yes.
Oh my gracious, I didn't know that I was. I'm just listening and learning, and I
Okay.
like the questions that you have asked. So let me, I can't figure out these technological things. So I'm gonna try to go back to mute. I'm
Oh, it's
listening.
totally fine. Just thought you had
Okay.
something to say. All right.
Okay.
Well, that concludes our session, our meeting. And again, let's thank our wonderful presenters. Thank you all for sharing with us, for deepening our understanding of your project, broadening our outlook as it relates to engaging or collaborating rather with descendant communities. And we hope that those of you who have a little more time this evening, that you will join us for our Lemon Project Genealogical Research Roundtable. We have a special guest joining us tonight. You'll learn more about her. So again, thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon and then have a good weekend as well.